Here's a guy who thinks we should be challenged by his story about prayer working.
It's been around a year since a close friend of mine changed his mind 180 degrees from saying that prayer is nothing but a mental exercise to admitting that God really does answer prayer as a result of something that happened to him which he never expected. In this video, I'll tell his story, and if you're wondering whether prayer actually works, you should totally watch this. However, if you're thinking that I'm trying to prove to you that God answers prayer, you're mistaken. Instead, the real point of my story is far more surprising and challenging than you may think.
Oh boy, anecdotal evidence. How challenging.
We would go out for lunch once a month or so at the Burger King just around the corner from my office. And usually, Tom would show up with a list of philosophical questions about God, and we would talk through them. Now, one time as we were talking over our burgers and fries, Tom revealed the following. You know, overall, Christianity does look rational, but I have a list of specific things that prevent me from actually believing in it. My immediate response was to ask, well, what's on the top of that list? He replied, it's prayer. I just can't believe that prayer works. It may be nice as a mental exercise that helps people to feel better about themselves, but I simply can't believe that God, if He exists, would really intervene in our world. He also said that he's absolutely convinced of his position and that he can't imagine ever changing his mind about it.
Of all of the issues Christianity has, prayer was his big sticking point. For me, it's the incomprehensibility of saying that a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind exists. I have to get past that before I can contemplate how such a being behaves or responds to human behavior.
I told Tom the following right away. You know, we could talk through this question of whether God answers prayer the way we talk through other questions. But really, I don't believe that me giving you arguments or even sharing my personal experiences will be helpful in any way. Instead, the only thing that could ever make a difference is if you have an experience with prayer. He agreed and thought that this made sense, but he asserted in the same breath, yet again, that he really can't imagine how anything in the world could ever change his mind.
For me, a personal experience with prayer would be the least convincing evidence for its efficacy, aside from an anecdote about someone else's personal experience with prayer. Either way, such experiences are anecdotes, and are thus among the weakest forms of evidence. What would be far more compelling to me is experiments with massive sample sets that show something strongly correlating with prayer. They would be far more likely to convince me that prayer has some kind of effect than even the most improbable personal experience. Even such experiments, however, wouldn't convince me that the efficacy of prayer was due to anything supernatural, because I still wouldn't understand what that would even mean.
You know, I have a few close friends who say that if they just saw God intervene in their lives, they would actually believe. And I would love to see God do exactly that for them, but I must say that in many cases, I'm still waiting for it to happen, which is something I kind of struggle with, and it leaves me wondering sometimes, why wouldn't God just do it, you know?
If a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind intervened in my life, I have no idea what that would look like, so I doubt I would recognize it as such.
So that was how Tom and I departed from Burger King that day. Him convinced that prayer doesn't work and that nothing will ever change his mind. And me with serious doubts that the only thing that could ever change his mind would ever actually happen. Then, some 3 weeks later, at our weekly Bible study in Starbucks, we read a passage which was all about prayer, and for most of the evening, our discussion centered around the question of whether human free will and the idea of God responding to prayer is compatible with divine omniscience.
Well, it would certainly make prayer pointless, wouldn't it? If God is omniscient, then it's not like prayer gives him information that he doesn't already have, or that his mind isn't already made up about what he is or is not going to do, and you're changing it by praying, so what's the point?
Tom was mostly silent throughout the discussion, but at the very end he said, "Guys, you all know that I've been suffering from this brain condition, and God simply hasn't done anything about it, even though people have prayed for me, which is why I've come to the conclusion that prayer just doesn't work.
That would also be a hasty conclusion. While effective prayer still wouldn't convince me that anything supernatural is going on, I could still be convinced that it has some kind of effect if it was followed by the intended consequences, like 80% of the time, which it isn't, even if it never worked for me personally.
Now, as we wrapped up that Bible study in Starbucks, one of my friends took Tom aside to ask him whether he could say a short prayer for him. And Tom gladly accepted, because while he was convinced that this wasn't going to make any difference, he was still open-minded enough to go for it anyway. The following week, we were scheduled for our monthly lunch at Burger King. Now, I was there first, waiting for Tom in front of the counter. As he walked in, he said hi and directly went on, "Hey Lucas, can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure, go ahead. What is it?" He told me, "You know, the last 2 weeks, my headache has been so intense that if I had to pin it down on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being no pain and 10 being so painful that you want to kill yourself, I was constantly on a 9. And even though I've been taking very strong medication, I haven't been able to catch even just 1 hour of sleep a night because my body can't wind down due to the pain. But then on Thursday, George prayed for me and I went home after that. As I arrived, I went up to my room, fell on my bed and slept for 12 hours straight. And since then, every night, I've been sleeping like a log for 12 uninterrupted hours, which is why I stopped my medication. And yet, I'm still enjoying the most blissful sleep ever." Then he said, and I absolutely love the way he put it, "Why do you think that is?"
So people have prayed for him before, and his headaches didn't go away, but eventually after they kept praying, the headaches went away. Not only does that look like a coincidence, it's not even an interesting coincidence. If it had been the case that he had never prayed for his headaches to go away, and nobody else had ever prayed for them to go away, but they went away right after the only time prayer was ever tried, that would at least be a hell of a coincidence. It still wouldn't be convincing, but at least it would be an impressive coincidence. Headaches going away after a prayer, when such a prayer seems like at least a semi-regular occurrence for him, is a pretty banal coincidence.
Now, I couldn't suppress a smile and responded, "Well, the real question is, why do you think that is?" Then we ordered our meals and sat down and talked for at least 2 hours straight about what happened, why it could or couldn't be explained as a mere coincidence, or why God would answer this prayer but not the prayers of other people who suffer even greater pain than Tom does, etc., etc. And I got to witness Tom really wrestling with the tension between his hardcore conviction that prayer doesn't work and the powerful experience he just went through.
How hardcore a conviction could it possibly have been if an anecdotal correlation, and a very loose one given that only one prayer out of multiple prayers was followed by relief of his headaches, could shake that conviction?
And as I said, Tom has a very sharp mind, so he really wanted to make sure he wouldn't give up his conviction before checking out all the options. But the fact of the matter was that Tom saw himself faced with what he thought was quite an overwhelming package of evidence. Not only that, but he has a strong commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads. And so at the end of our conversation, he admitted that there was no escaping the conclusion that he had been wrong about this prayer thing, and that what he experienced was, in fact, nothing short of God's tangible intervention in his life in response to prayer.
Inescapable conclusion? I don't know, dude. That seems like quite a wet paper bag of a conclusion to me.
So let me clarify what I am saying in this video. Here's a person who was not only 100% convinced that prayer doesn't work, but also 100% convinced that nothing will ever change his mind. So to say that confirmation bias doesn't apply to Tom's case is quite an understatement. Against all odds, Tom did end up changing his mind, and he did come to the conclusion that God does answer prayer, even though he had been convinced that nothing could ever change what he thought was true. Which is why the real takeaway from my video is this. You might be 100% convinced that God doesn't answer prayer. Now, there is nothing wrong per se with having strong convictions. On the contrary, I think that's a great thing. But the challenge posed by Tom's story is this. If you share the hardcore conviction against prayer he used to have, you might be next in having that very conviction challenged, or maybe even turned around 180 degrees, provided, and this is key, that you go about things with an open mind.
So you're sharing this anecdotal evidence of the efficacy of prayer as anecdotal evidence of the doxastic influence of anecdotal evidence on people who have an open mind? If having an open mind means that my strongest convictions can be shaken by a single, very weak anecdotal correlation, I don't really see the value in that.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.